You know, when you hear the names Trump and Epstein, a certain story probably jumps to mind. But what if there's a totally different version of that story? Today, we're going to dive into a narrative from one specific source, Sky News Australia, that completely reframes their relationship, not as friends or even associates, but as outright enemies.
So the big question has always been, right? Were they friends? It's pretty much the foundation for a ton of articles and theories out there. But the source we're looking at today doesn't just question that idea. It argues for the exact opposite.
And boom, there it is, a claim that's about as blunt and unambiguous as it gets. This one idea that Epstein hated Trump is the absolute cornerstone of this whole counter-narrative. So, how do they back this up? Let's dig into the evidence they point to.
Right, so how do they build this case? This brings us to our first section, where this counter-narrative starts to take shape. And we're not just talking about opinions here. We're going to break down the specific pieces of evidence that the commentators point to piece by piece to make the argument that these two were actually sworn enemies. Okay, so the whole thing, the entire argument, really seems to pivot on one single moment in time, an event that's presented as the smoking gun in this whole story, a police call that was made way back nearly 2 decades ago. So let's set the scene. We're going back to Palm Beach in 2006. And according to this source, this isn't just some random date. No, this is the moment they claim the dominoes really started to fall, kicking off a conflict that would apparently last for years.
Now, what's really important here is where this info is coming from. The commentators aren't just making a claim, they're pointing to an actual FBI document. And this document reportedly contains an interview with the police chief who led that very first Epstein investigation down in Palm Beach. And this is the quote that's right at the center of this whole thing. According to the police chief's own account to the FBI, this is what Donald Trump said to him on the phone. The source presents this as proof that Trump was actively pushing for the investigation into Epstein.
But here's the kicker, the thing the commentators really want you to focus on, the timing. This call didn't happen after Epstein was already a known public villain. It was back in 2006, before the first charges were ever even filed. They frame this as a huge distinction, suggesting it was a proactive move, not just a reaction.
Okay, but a story like this needs more than just one phone call, right? And according to the source, there is more. They argue there's a much bigger pattern of hostility. And that brings us to the wider evidence of animosity that they present.
And here are a couple of the main points they bring up. First, something very public. Epstein was apparently kicked out of and banned from Trump's Mar-a-Lago club. And second, something a bit more behind the scenes. The claim that years later, Epstein was actively giving advice to a political opponent on how to best attack the Trump administration.
Now, to add another layer to this, the commentators bring in a pretty surprising witness, the author Michael Wolff. And it's really important how they frame him, not as some neutral party, but as a Trump-hating author. And the thinking here seems to be, hey, if even a guy who can't stand Trump is saying this, well, then it must be true.
And this is what they pull from Wolff's reporting. The claim is that Epstein himself was convinced that Trump was the one who tipped off the cops. And from that moment forward, they weren't just rivals. They were, in Wolff's own words, bitter enemies.
All right, so you've got the phone call, the Mar-a-Lago ban, the quote from Wolff. How does the source pull all of this together and connect it to what's happening today? That brings us to their final take, where they try to connect all the dots.
So this is how they explain it. When you see Trump's name pop up in those Epstein files, they argue it's not because they were pals. Not at all. In their view, every single mention is just a reflection of Epstein's deep-seated hatred for him, a paper trail of his attacks on him.
And in the end, this is the whole point for the commentators. They're using all of this, the FBI file, the Wolff quotes, the Mar-a-Lago ban, as definitive proof against what they flat-out call a political smear campaign.
And that's where we'll leave it. We've just walked through how one source builds a really powerful, detailed counter-narrative. It's a pretty fascinating look at how these specific claims and quotes can be woven together to challenge a belief that a lot of people hold. And it leaves us all with a much bigger question to think about. How do these specific, detailed accounts end up shaping the giant, public stories we all hear and believe?